Welcome to Halachot Pesach. We are working in the sefer called Chazon Ovadia by Chacham Ovadia Yosef. In today's class, we're going to continue in the laws of checking for Chametz. This will be part 2 of the class. The halacha begins. Habidika tzricha liyod leor ner shel sha'ava. This bidika that we're going to start doing on the 14th of Nisan at night after the stars come out, it needs to be done by the light of a wax candle. Aval, however, ner avuka pasul libidika. However, if you have a candle that's like a torch-like candle, that is going to be disqualified for the use, for the checking of the Chametz on the 14th of Nisan at night. Now, Chacham Ovadia is going to explain to us, how can a person go ahead and use a torch-like candle? Now, I don't know how many people have those Havdalah candles in their house, right? Every single Havdalah candle, it must have at least 2 wicks. That's what's considered to be called a torch. However, there is a very big difference, as Chacham Ovadia himself is going to explain. If I have 2 separate wax candles, and I twist them together, I make them like one, and the wicks itself are also twisted with one another, that's considered to be like one candle. However, what happens if I go ahead and I twist the candles themselves, the wax candles, but the wicks, they're not twisted with one another, but rather they're both separate like this. So when I turn on the fire over here, and I turn on the fire over here, they're both touching. The wicks of the fire, they're both touching. The fires are touching. This, Rabotai, is called a torch. So comes the Chacham Ovadia and he says, look, when it comes to doing the checking on the 14th of Nisan at night, you have to make sure that you're using one candle. And it's preferable you should use a wax candle. However, he says, Aval ner avuka, but if you have a torch-like candle, pasul libidikam, it is disqualified for the checking of the Chametz. What is the reason? So he explains, Mepanei, because she'einu yachol lahachnisol lechorim ulesedakim, because you're not able to bring it in where the holes and the crevices or the cracks are to check if there's chametz there or not. Ve'ot, and furthermore, shehu mityareh pen tifros deleka. He's afraid lest, Rabotai, there's going to be a breakout, chas v'shalom, and the fire is going to ignite, v'tilkach kol asher bebeito, and it's going to take everything in the house. Meaning, Rabotai, if you're using a torch-like candle, you know what the problem is? Since the fire is very high, by you trying to go ahead and check, you're afraid, chas v'shalom, it's going to catch fire somewhere. So therefore, what's going to end up happening? V'nimtain is going to come out. Libot tarud. Your heart is occupied, meaning your mind is not fully set on the checking for the chametz. Ve'eno mechaven da'atol b'dik, and you don't have the proper intent in your mind when it comes for searching of the chametz. Comes that you're not going to be able to do the checking of the chametz the proper way. So therefore, Chacham Ovadia comes and he says that when it comes for the searching of the chametz on the 14th of the Nisan at night, make sure you are using one candle where the fire is not too high, and don't use a torch-like candle where you're going to worry about it and you're not going to be able to check the chametz correctly or properly. However, Chacham Ovadia says, V'im avar ubadak leor ha'avuka, and if you did go ahead and you checked by the light of a torch-like candle, tzarich lachzor ulevdok baner kasher. You need to go back and you need to recheck with a kosher candle. However, he says, lo yivarech shenit, do not bless a second time. So here, Rabotai, we're going to explain what's considered to be one candle and what's considered to be a torch-like candle. V'shtei nerot kaluot. What happens if you have 2 braided candles, wax candles? Sheshal havatan nogat zo bezo, that their fires are touching one another. Dinam ke'avuka, their law is going to be like a torch. Comes out, you're not going to be able to use such a candle, a braided candle, for the checking of the chametz. Aval, however, Imam pitilot negoot zo bezo. However, if the wicks are touching each other, nechshav hakol lener echad kosher. All this is considered to be like one kosher candle. V'davka k'shapitilot mechulokot, and specifically when the wicks are divided u'mifarodot and are separate, zo mizo, one from another, v'raka shal hevet nogot achad b'shniya, and only the fire touches the first one to the second one, nechshav la'avuka, over there is going to be considered like a torch. So all Chacham Ovadia is telling us like this: if you're using a braided candle, if you have these Havdalah candles, correct? If you're seeing those big Havdalah candles, over there you have a lot of wicks, Rabotai. They're not, even though the wax candle itself is braided, but the wicks on top, they're not braided. That you're not going to be able to use. Even if you have those smaller Havdalah candles, where you have, 3 candles braided, or even 2 candles braided into one another, but the point is, if the wicks are not also braided, if they're not touching, if the wicks are not like one, we're going to tell you you're not allowed to go ahead and use such a candle. But what happens, even if the candles are not braided, but the wicks themselves are braided, they're touching, they're like one, that we're going to tell you it's like one kosher candle, and you're allowed to go ahead and you are allowed to check the chametz with that type of candle. But Rabotai, we have to remember, if you went ahead and you checked with a torch-like candle where the 2 wicks were separate from one another, but the fires were touching each other, that's not considered to be a kosher candle, and you have to go back and you have to recheck everything again, but without saying a blessing the second time. Continues Chacham Ovadia. Upanas kis katan, a small flashlight, sheyachol hachnisol lechorim u'lesedakim, that you are able to put it in small holes and cracks in order to be able to check if there's chametz there. V'chen, and so too ner chashmali katan, and so too if you have a small electric lamp, she'efshar letaltelo bechol pinot habayit, that you are able to move it throughout all the corners of the house, meaning you are able to carry this electric lamp with you. Comes Chacham Ovadia and he says, mutar levdok bahem b'sha'at atzorech she'en lo ner acher kosher. We're going to allow you to check with the flashlight or this small electric lamp in a time of need when you do not have any other kosher candle. Rabotai, I want to try to make something clear. People think using a flashlight, listen, you want to give your child a flashlight, I don't mind. Your small children, they want to have a good time, go ahead, be my guest. But the one that is checking, say the father or the mother, or say the children, adults, when they're checking Rabotai, lechatchila, we want them to do it by the light of a candle, not by the light of a flashlight or an electric lamp. All this that we're telling you are allowed to use a flashlight or a small electric lamp, that is specifically when you don't have a kosher candle. But if you do have a kosher candle, you should use a kosher candle. Continues Chacham Ovadia and he says, what about blessing on it? V'yachol gam ken levarech alahem, and you are also able to bless on a flashlight or on a electric lamp. Ve'en ze domen le'avuka, and this is not comparable to a torch. Continues Chacham Ovadia. Ve'en levdok chametz al yidei ner chelev. You should not check for chametz through a candle which is made from forbidden fat. Why? Mipenesha bodek choshesh, because the one that is checking, he's concerned. Pen yativ al klei hamidbach v'yasaram. He's concerned maybe while he's checking for chametz, the fat, this forbidden fat, is going to drip on the kitchen utensils and is going to forbid them. Because remember, Rabotai, you should not use a candle that is made out of chelev, meaning forbidden fat, because if it's going to drip, it can go ahead and it's going to make the utensils not kosher. So that's what Chacham Ovadia tells us over here. You should not check for chametz through candles which are made out of forbidden fat, because the one that is checking, he's concerned. Pen yativ al klei hamidbach, lest it's going to drip on the kitchen utensils, and it's going to forbid them. And he's not going to place his heart, meaning he's not going to pay attention in the checking for the chametz properly. So therefore we don't want you to use a candle that is made out of forbidden fat. Continues Rav Chaim Igal, and he's going to bring us a few more examples of which candles you should not also use in the checking for the chametz. V'chen, and so too, ein livdog bener shel shuman. You should not check with a candle where the candle is made out of kosher fat. Chelev is forbidden fat. Shuman is kosher fat. Nevertheless, he says, do not check with such a candle. Why? Because the check is concerned, maybe it's going to drip on dairy utensils via saram, and it's going to make it forbidden. Why? Mishum basar bechalav, because of the whole concept of meat and milk. Continues Rav Chaim Igal to give us another example. V'chen, and so too, ein livdog bener shel shemen. Do not check the chametz with a candle of oil. Why? Shechoshesh pen yativ al begadav, because he's concerned maybe now it's going to drip on his clothing. V'gam lo yuchal hakniso lechorim l'sadakim, and plus you're not able to go ahead and bring it in to the holes and the crevices. Ubi diavad, after the fact, im badak b'shalosh elo. What happens if you went ahead after the fact and you checked with these three type of candles, with chelef, shuman, and shemen, with the forbidden fat, the permitted fat, and with oil? Yatsa yedei chovat bidika, you have fulfilled your obligation. So comes Rav Chaim Igal and he tells us over here, Rabotai, very important. Ubi davad, and after the fact, im badak b'shalosha eila, if you went ahead and you checked with these three candles, which were made out of chelev, shuman, or shemen, yatsa yedei chovat bidika, you have fulfilled your obligation in the checking. V'hanerot shel parafin hamutzim kiyom kesherim lebidika, and the candles which are made from paraffin, which are found today, they are kosher for checking for the chametz. Now Rav Chaim Igal is going to explain to us what happens, Rabotai, if a person wants to go take wool. You know how they used to round up the wool and they used to dip it into the oil and then they would light it. Are you allowed to search for chametz like that with such a candle? Upitilat temer geven, if you have a wick which is made out of wool, tivula b'shem, which is dipped in oil, dina kener shel shava, its laws are going to be like that of a wax candle. Continues Rav Chaim Igal. Ve'ein tzorich lechabot et or hachashmal hadolek b'bayit be'et bedik chametz, and there's no need to turn off the electricity which is on in the house during the checking of the chametz. You don't have to turn it off. If you want to turn it off, it's going to give the kids that adrenaline run. It's going to make them very happy. Or you want to make it exciting. You are allowed to do so, but you are not required to take off the electricity at the time of the search. Continues Rav Chaim Igal. Im badak belal yud gimel leor haner, if a person went ahead and he checked at the night of the 13th of Nisan by the light of the candle, ein tzarich lachzor v'levdog belal yudalet, you do not need to go back and to recheck on the 14th of the night of Nisan. Continues Rav Chaim Igal with the next halacha. Asur lechol suda shel pat o uga yuter mishiur kibeitza beli kilipata. One is forbidden to eat a meal of bread or cake more than the measurement of an egg without its shell. That's about 50 grams, as we'll see. Rav Chaim Igal himself is going to speak about it. Kodem b'dikat hachametz, prior to the checking of the chametz. Hachal mechatzi sha'a kodem zman habidika, which takes effect a half an hour before the time of the checking for the chametz. Comes Rav Chaim Igal and he says, let's say the bidikat chametz, the checking for the chametz begins at 7:45. That's when nightfall is. You need to go back 30 minutes, which is going to give me 7:15. From 7:15 and on, you're not allowed to eat a bread meal which contains more than 50 grams of bread, and you are also not allowed to eat cake which is more than 50 grams a half an hour prior to the checking for the chametz. However, before that half an hour, you are allowed to. That's not a problem. What we're speaking about is in that half an hour from 7:15 to 7:45, over there you're not allowed to begin a bread meal where it contains more than 50 grams of bread, or cake where it contains more than 50 grams of cake. Aval, however, he says, Le'chol pat ad shi'ur kebetza beliklipata ki 50 gram mutar. However, he says to go ahead and eat bread until the measurement of like an egg without its shell, which is about 50 grams, that is going to be permitted even in the 30 minutes before the checking of the chametz. Uperot v'yirakot mutar afilu yoter mikibetza. In the 30 minutes, you are even allowed to eat fruit and vegetables more than the measurement of a kibetza, meaning more than 50 grams. V'chen, and so too, tav shel orez, if you want to have a cooked dish which is made out of rice, v'kiyotzen, anything similar to that, mutar, you are allowed to go ahead and you are allowed to eat it in the 30 minutes prior to the checking for the chametz. V'kol sheken shemutar l'shtot kos kafe o teh. And for sure you are allowed to drink a cup of coffee or tea. V'chen, and so too, asur latchil b'shum malacha chatzi sha'a kodem zman habidik. And so too, one is not allowed to begin any form of work a half an hour before the time of the checking for the chametz. Same concept, Rabotai. If 7:45 is when I have to check for chametz, go back half an hour, which is going to be 7:15. Now, if I have to start a new job at 7:15, I'm not allowed to do that, Rabotai. However, he says, what happens if you began in a permissible way when it came to eating or when it came to doing the malacha, when it came to working, meaning you began, say, more than 30 minutes prior to the checking of the chametz. For example, 7:45, let's say you have to go ahead and you have to check for chametz. You started the job at 7:10. It's not 30 minutes prior, it's 40 minutes prior or even 35 minutes prior. That is not a problem. That's considered to be in a permissible way. One can begin their meal 40 minutes or even 35 minutes prior to the checking of the chametz. And you are also allowed to begin a work. That's considered to be in a permissible way. But in the 30 minutes, let's say from 7:15 till 7:45 when you have to check, over there we're not going to allow you to eat more than 50 grams of bread or cake, and we're not going to allow you to begin a new malacha. So that's what he tells us over here. And if you began in a permissible way when it came to eating, meaning you started eating way before the 30-minute period, that 30-minute window period before the checking for the chametz, or even in the work, even though you don't need to stop because you began in a permissible way, nevertheless, vadai, for sure, if you want to stop, tavo alav berecha me'Hashem, send blessings upon you. Continues Chaim Igal with the next halakha, and he states, V'chein asur latchil lilmod misha'a she'higia zman bidika ad she'yivdok. Now listen to this very carefully, Rabotai. And so too, it is forbidden for one to begin to learn Torah from the time once you have reached the time to start searching for the chametz. Rabotai, it is completely different than eating and working. Why? When it comes to eating and working, we're telling you you're not allowed to start eating more than 50 grams of bread or more than 50 grams of cake half an hour prior to the checking. However, when it comes to learning, we're not telling you half an hour prior to learning you're not allowed to learn. That we are not saying. What we are saying over here, when the time of the bidika comes, you're not allowed to begin to learn at that time. For example, if the checking starts at 7:45 p.m. and now you want to sit down and learn Torah, that you're not allowed to do. But Rabotai, it's very important to note. I was one time in a certain shul where the rabbi said even 30 minutes prior to the checking for the chametz, you're not allowed to learn Torah. He said it out loud. I actually corrected him afterwards. He didn't want to agree with me, but eventually the next morning he made up for it. He said he made a mistake because I brought up the point. What do you mean? 30 minutes of bittul Torah? What did you just tell the people? I said, it doesn't make sense. So therefore, Rabotai, you have to be careful in this halakha. I want to read it one more time. And so too, it is forbidden for one to learn Torah, to begin to learn Torah, from the time, once the time of the Bidika came, you are not allowed to start to begin to learn ad sheyivdok, until you check. However, says Chacham Ovadia, Aval im yitchil lilmod beheter lifnei zman habidika. But what happens if you began learning Torah in a permissible way, which means to say before the time of the checking for the Chametz, and tzarich lafsik, you don't have to stop. V'chol ze biyachid, and all this is when you're learning individually. Halomed beno leben atzmo, when you're learning by yourself. Aval shiur haneimar berabim. However, if we're dealing with a lecture which is stated with many people, bechol yom be'erev, which is said with many people every single day in the evening, efshar likaymo gam belel yudalid, you are able to still continue giving that class even on the night of the 14th of Nisan, even the time of the Bidika came, kodem ha-Bidika, even before checking. Av al-pi sheneimshach sha'a o yuter, even though the lecture is going to continue 1 or 2 hours into the night, we're not concerned. Why? Mishum sharabim maskirim ze et ze, because the many people, they're going to remind one another. Ve'en lachshosh, we don't have to be concerned, sheishkachu levdok kishelchu lebitehem, that they're going to forget to check when they're going to go home. Rabotai comes to Chacham Ovadia and he says like this: when you're dealing with an individual, we're going to tell him not to begin learning at the time once the time for the Bedikat Chametz came. For example, if 7:45 came and you were not learning, don't begin to learn. That you shouldn't do, because we are afraid you're going to start learning and you're going to forget to do Bedikat Chametz. You're going to forget to start searching for the Chametz, or you might, completely forget about it and not do it. However, he says, but when you're dealing with a lecture or a Torah class that's given to the public every single night, and let's say when they do it, it's at 7:45 every single evening, we're going to tell you they are allowed to do it even before they're going to go home and check. Why? Because we're going to say that each person, since there's so many people, they're going to remind one another to go ahead and make sure that they're going to check their houses for Chametz. Continue Chacham Ovadia to say that even though when you're giving a Torah class to the public and there's no concern that the people are going to forget to start doing the Bidika after they go home, nevertheless, Chacham Ovadia says, Umikom akom, and nevertheless, Tov, it's good, she'im si'um shi'ur, with the conclusion of the Torah lecture, Yachriz v'yaskir shamash, the attendant should mention and remind Shamishtafavim b'shi'ur, the ones that were joining in the shi'ur in the Torah class, Yilchu levdok chametz, that they should go and check the chametz. So Chacham Ovadia is telling us like this: even though there are many people that are going to remind one another to go ahead and check for chametz, it is good that the attendant or the gabbai in the class should go ahead and make an announcement stating, please everybody go home and check your houses for chametz. Rabotai, now that we know that you are allowed to go ahead and you are allowed to give a Torah class even at the time when the Bidika has to be done, meaning at 7:45, even though the people still didn't check their houses, nevertheless, Chacham Ovadia says, I want to make this clear, he says, Eila shegam berabim, rather also when we're speaking about a public lecture, lo hitiru ela peskei halachot, we only allowed Pesach halacha, meaning halachot which are, clear and concise, or daf yomi, or, learning daf yomi, or shiur mishnayot, or a lecture on mishnayot. Believe people, Rabotai, this is very important. Without deep, complex, analytical learning, very, very important. Kenahug bezel balabatim, like it is the custom when you teach the balabatim, you don't go into analytical teaching and analytical learning with them. You teach them simple stuff. That's what he says. Over there, we're going to allow you to go ahead and give such a class, even at the time when you have to start checking for chametz. Aval, people law. However, when it comes to analytical learning, over there, Rabotai, even with the Rabbim, even though you're giving a class to the many people, over there we're not going to allow you. Why? Shema yimshechu acharei people. Maybe you're going to be drawn after the people, after the analytical learning, v'yishkechu livdok, and you're going to forget to do bedikat chametz. However, Chacham Ovadia says, V'im yudi'im bibirur, if you know for sure, she'en chashash bitol Torah, v'kulam chozrim achar bedika, if you know for sure that there's going to be no concern where people are going to cancel learning Torah and everybody's going to come back after the checking of the Chametz, adif tefei, it is more better, lahagdim habedika, it is more better that you allow them to go home and come back and afterwards have the shi'ur. So what is the Chaim Ovadia saying? He's giving us over here two options. According to the letter of the law, if you have a rabbi that's teaching the masses, he's allowed to do it even at the time when people have the obligation to check their houses for Chametz. We're not concerned they're going to forget like we explained. However, Chacham Ovadia says, if let's say the rabbi or the Talmud Chacham, they know that they have only 5 people learning or 10 people, and they tell each one of them, look, can we trust you that if you're going to go home now and do the bedika, because we want you to do the bedika right away, once nightfall hits, can we trust you to come back? And there shouldn't be any form of bittul Torah, meaning people shouldn't say, oh, I'm tired, I cannot come now. My wife made me stay home, I have to go shopping. If there is a concern for bittul Torah, Torah takes precedence. We're going to tell the rabbi, let him continue giving his class. But if there's no concern for bittul Torah, we're going to tell you, let them go home at night, do the bidika at its proper time, and then come back to the class and learn Torah. Rabotai, look how severe bittul Torah is. Continues the Chacham Ovadia and he says another halacha. Im adayin lo yitpalel aravit. If you still did not pray aravit, v'giz man bidika, and now the time for the checking of the chametz came, what should you do first? Yagdim litpalel aravit. Proceed with praying aravit first. Ve'achar kach yivdok, and afterwards you should go ahead and check your house for chametz. Ve'im yesham ish ach, if you have some other man there in the synagogue, yomar lo, tell him, she'askirichu levdok miyad la'achat tefilato, that he should remind you to check his house immediately after the prayer. Basically, make yourself an alarm that you have to go ahead and you have to check your house for chametz. The summary for part 2 of the class. The checking should ideally be done with a single wick wax candle because it gives focused light and can enter cracks and corners. A torch-like flame is invalid because it is unsafe and prevents proper checking. If necessary, a small flashlight or electric light that can reach tight areas may be used, and one may even recite the blessing on it. Certain types of candles like fat or oil candles are discouraged because they distract the person from concentrating. There is no need to turn off electric lights during the search. From a half an hour before the time of checking, one may not begin eating a substantial amount of bread or cake, more than about an egg's volume. We said that, Rabotai, it's 50 grams. Nor begin work or personal study, so that one does not forget the mitzvah. Light eating fruits, vegetables, and drinks are permitted even in the 30 minutes prior to the checking of the chametz. If one already began before that time, meaning you began eating, working, he does not have to stop, but it is proper to do so. Public Torah classes may continue since people remind each other. If one has not yet prayed Ma'ariv, he should pray first and then perform the search and ensure he does not forget afterward. Rabotai, have a great day. Baruch Adonai L'Olam. Amen ve'amen.